very much. Actually, its turnout is fantastic. I think it's actually neither Rothko nor me who's attracted to all but my spectacular title there, Exclusive Serenity and Hellfire. I'm sure it lured you all in as it was designed to do. Okay, if we could lower the lights. Right, we want to do several things tonight. Partly talk about Rothko's own idea of his pictures and how he wanted them to be seen. He was always trying to articulate a way of approaching his work and having great difficulty doing that. And he used the words of critics to help him. Well, let me not anticipate that part. Let me just jump into the talk. For an artist who professed hatred of art critics, Rothko had a surprisingly productive relationship with them. He's been quoted as saying to a friend, who was the editor of Harper's Magazine, quote, "I hate and distrust all art historians, experts, and critics. They're a bunch of parasites feeding on the body of art. A painting doesn't need anybody to explain what it is about. If it is any good, it speaks for itself, and a critic who tries to add to that statement is presumptuous." Not mincing any words there, typically, that was Rothko's style. On some occasions, he reportedly went so far as to threaten to sue people for writing about his work. But on the other hand, he expressed profound gratitude toward those critics whose writings pleased him. Here are his own words again, just 2 years later, this is 1961, from a letter of appreciation to the English critic David Sylvester, about whom we'll be talking quite a bit tonight. Sylvester wrote, here's what Rothko wrote to Sylvester. "First of all, my gratitude, not because your review appeared, but because a person has seen so fully, has had such insight into the meaning and purpose of the pictures. I'm grateful, too, for the fervor which you possess and the ability to think and formulate. What is satisfying to me in putting on a show like this is that at least one person rise to the heights to which the pictures aspire." Rothko made no secret of his approval for the work of 3 or 4 critics, some of whom he encouraged to undertake larger writing projects about himself and his paintings. His attitudes toward critics were not at all unusual among artists pursuing success within the so-called dealer-critic system, in which the increasing power of critics made them simultaneously necessary allies and dangerous judges. If Rothko expressed these attitudes in a way that highlighted their conflict and intensity, is there a problem?
I think you might
Oh, it's not loud. Oh, this is actually the mic.
Is your engine is turned off?
I don't think so. I think it's just working.
Could you turn it off a little bit then, Nick?
Turn it off?
Is
It's
it
working.
okay?
The volume's okay.
Okay, just wanted to know.
Okay, thanks. So Rothko's attitude toward critics, the conflicted feelings towards critics, were not at all unusual. You know, it's an aspect of the power of critics, and you know, the benefits of affiliation with them. But if Rothko expressed his attitudes in a way that highlighted their conflict and intensity, we shouldn't be surprised by that fact. Intense conflict was a trademark of his thought and his art, as I'll try to demonstrate tonight. Let me change the slide here. Okay. Because Rothko was so explicit about his opinions of the writings of particular critics, there's special incentive for examining the early reviews of his work. And by early reviews, I mean the reviews that appeared in the period between about 1949, when his color abstractions reached their mature form, and 1961, when they were beginning to be tamed by familiarity, and a kind of standard way of talking about them was in effect. I think early reviews, like the ones I'll be describing tonight, are always interesting for what they tell us about the ways in which an artist's work accrues meaning and significance, and about the contemporary concerns the work is found to address. And moreover, in Rothko's case, The artist engaged his critics directly enough to reveal the dialogical process, the conversation between Rothko and the critics, by which his own understanding of his art evolved. Excavating the deliberations of this early interpretive community, which included the artist himself, can reveal distinctive features of Rothko's paintings developing in concert with viewer responses to the pictures. This also brings Rothko's artistic project into sharper focus. And knowing more about the heights to which his pictures aspired, we can better judge if and how those ambitions are achieved and how they figure in our own desires and demands of his art. Despite his belief that good painting speaks for itself, Rothko felt acutely a desire to find words to fit his paintings. His personal papers make it clear that he tried repeatedly throughout his career to compose written statements that would help viewers approach his work in the spirit that he thought was proper. Most of his efforts were evidently laborious and frustrating to judge by the number of drafts that he produced and by his abandonment of several of them. When he gave up one attempt in 1954, he blamed it on the fear that his words would become an instrument that would, quote, tell the public how the picture should be looked at and what to look for, resulting in paralysis of the mind and imagination, and for the artist, a premature entombment, unquote. So that was the challenge then. How could words be used to help viewers rise to the picture's heights without limiting their responses? Words could be reductive, they could have the same effect as recognizable elements in the pictures, and so, like the latter, were best minimized. Silence is so accurate, he told Elaine de Kooning. On the whole, he preferred that his art be nestled in silence, but the drive to find words for his pictures was unceasing. Rothko's own comments, those he was successful in putting to paper or making to an interviewer, left no doubt that, in his view, intense, overpowering emotion was the content of his paintings. Let's move to this picture. I'm going to use some of his paintings as backdrops for my comments just for a little while, and then we'll look closely at them and talk about formal elements of them in some detail. So this much, that his paintings were intense, overpowering emotional statements. This much he said clearly and definitively on many occasions. Here's the way he put it to the author Selwyn Rodman. I'm interested only in expressing basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom, and so on. And the fact that lots of people break down and cry when confronted with my pictures shows that I communicate those basic human emotions. The people who weep before my pictures are having the same religious experience I had when I painted them. Unquote. None of Rothko's early reviewers admitted to being reduced to tears by his illustrations, but most acknowledged that the paintings provoked strong emotional responses and deep philosophical ruminations. The 1961 review that Rothko approved so enthusiastically, that one from David Sylvester, is a good illustration of this. Sylvester emphasized that Rothko's paintings, quote, begin and end with an intense and utterly direct expression of feeling. I'm going to question how direct that expression of feelings is, but more on that momentarily. It was not enough, however, simply to assert a profound emotional response to Rothko's work. Many, if not most, of the early reviewers of his work did that. But there were two other features of Sylvester's review that were crucial, I think, to Rothko's enthusiasm for it. First, it did not construe the emotional content of the paintings as self-expression. That is, it took the subject of the work to be not the artist's own feelings or his moods, but large truths about human experience. Rothko's paintings, he wrote, convey man's passions. His is a tragic art, the equivalent of Chartres Cathedral in its transcendent, timeless emotionality, unquote. Rothko's own view was that while he was necessarily working from his own immediate personal experience, the significance of his paintings lay in what they revealed of human experience and the human condition. He called this his not-self. And here's how he encapsulated this position in response to questions following a lecture on his work. I prefer to communicate a view of the world that is not all of myself. Self-expression is boring. I want to talk about something outside of myself. Anyone who makes a statement about the world must be involved with self-expression, but not in stripping yourself of will, intelligence, civilization. My emphasis is on deliberateness. Truth must strip itself of self, which can be very deceptive. So he's saying there that he wants his conscious self to be the dominant one in his pictures, not the self stripped of will, intelligence, civilization, the self of surrealism and Jackson Pollock and the unconscious and the primitive. So in such statements as this, Rothko tried to differentiate his work from contemporary forms of self-expression that envisioned the core of self as rooted in unconscious, irrational, idiosyncratic elements, such as surrealism and Pollock. Rothko's painting his self and his not self brings us to that second feature he demanded in discussion of the emotions provoked by his paintings. Appreciation of complexity, conflict, paradox, and contradiction. Oxymoronic description suited him. That's why I title Divine Hellfire and Explosive Serenity is so appropriate for his work. Powerful emotion for Rothko was necessarily impure. He sought to evoke in viewers the simultaneous and acute experience of conflicting feelings, calm and agitation, stability and instability, hope and despair. The reviews Rothko most admired usually highlighted the conflict as well as the intensity of the emotional expression. And Sylvester, again, was explicit about this. Quote, "The value of his painting lies precisely in the paradox that he uses the apparatus of serenity in achieving violence. Violence and serenity are reconciled and fused. This is what makes Rothko's a tragic art." Unquote. That same point had been made some years earlier in a review by another person, an artist friend and critic of Rothko's, Hubert Crean, a review, again, for which Rothko had very kind words. And here's what Crean wrote. "The beauty of Rothko's painting is its evocation of the idea and the feeling that it is still possible for us to discover serenity in the midst of turbulence, and that by accepting the contradictions of our transitional times and the complexity of our desires, it is possible to create an abstract form of poise. His achievement is that with the simplest artistic means, he's made a symbol of contemporary experience that has the implication of a moment of peace while stating at the same time our worst forebodings." Unquote. This seems to be precisely the sort of thing that Rothko himself struggled to say. Significantly, Crean made vivid the emotional conflict he experienced before Rothko's painting through contrasting metaphors for the light in the paintings, the light he perceived in those paintings. Like many other early critics, Crean situated the expressive power of Rothko's work in its light. It was partly through light that this emotional intensity that Rothko wanted came through to viewers, those viewers at least who commented on their responses to his work. Rothko echoed Crean that same year. This is Rothko speaking to an interviewer and using words that sound eerily like those that Crean had just written. In a comment to an interviewer, Rothko said that his paintings had a serenity about to explode, unquote. He said he especially liked Crean's acknowledgement of a violent and dark component in the paintings, although I wonder whether the reference to the light of the atomic blast that Crean cited wouldn't have struck Rothko as too limiting, too historical. While it's true that the atomic bomb did take on biblical dimensions in the 1950s, symbolizing the punishment of an Old Testament God angered once more by his sinful creations, it could not have had the timelessness and naturalness of other divine punishments like the flood or the plague. As helpful as the bomb illusion may be for anyone attempting to understand the overheated rhetoric of tragedy and emotionality surrounding Rothko's art, the artist's own preference may well have been for a more expansive metaphor, something closer to the one attributed to an unnamed artist, a friend of Rothko's, who described his paintings as, quote, doorways to hell. Not only does the light of hellfire have a longer historical currency, it also forms a more perfect counterpole to the light of divine presence. We might wonder about these metaphors associated with Rothko's paintings: doorways to hell, atomic blasts, celestial beacons. Such associations must be powerful indicators and shapers of meaning, and they suggest that the expressive effects of abstract form were never pure, never simply direct from the form to the viewer, but were mediated by all kinds of metaphorical associations and references and allusions that the pictures evoked. Rothko recognized this, although he and his interpreters perpetually insisted on the directness of the art's expression. Far from trying to expunge metaphor, though, he worked with it. For example, in the matter of color, Rothko and his favorite critics sometimes assigned it a mood based on sometimes banal metaphors and associations. This painting, number 16, from 1956, Rothko reportedly said about this painting that the tangerine color could be understood to signify the normal, happier side of living, with the dark blue-green representing the black clouds or worries that hang over us, that often hang over us. So this is a particularly bad example of Rothko talking about metaphor. This is, I think, the kind of thing that he worried his words would do to his pictures: flatten out the meaning, reduce it to something too simple, something that would limit the way we interpret the pictures. And I hesitate to give you that reading of this picture because you'll now only be able to see it in those terms. But most of the time, he succeeded, and others succeeded, in balancing metaphorical allusions, metaphorical readings, so that no single one dominated. Similarly, and just as in color, also composition and paint handling also evoked metaphors and allusions according to contemporary codes, certain contemporary codes. The format of his pictures, that is, the arrangement of stacked rectangular areas of modulated color with softened and ambiguous boundaries, effectively signaled to viewers that an expressive interaction with color was being sought. Flat, if the color areas had been flat and even, or if they'd been hard-edged, that would not have served his purposes, because within the conventions of abstract painting at that moment, that kind of geometry would have signified cerebral or perceptual engagement with color, like this painting by Joseph Albers. Regularity in color density and application, hard edges, that kind of evenness, signified perceptual or conceptual issues. And Barnett Newman, Rothko's contemporary, tested the boundary with this kind of art in his own zip paintings, for those of you who know his work. Even Rothko's simplest paintings, in contrast to those of Albers or Mondrian or other geometric abstractionists, contain a wealth of variation and nuance in the handling of edges, layering, framing, and the dynamics of transparency and opacity operating in the pictures. This painting, Untitled, illustrates well the characteristic effects of transparency. Orange underpainting shows strongly through both the pink and black fields, if you look closely. The irregularity of the bottom edge of the black field, where it meets the orange, corresponds to the brushy upper edge of the pink, where it joins the gray ground. Such lightness and layering were metaphorically suggestive, as I'll propose in a moment. These formal devices that vary in his work were very effective in producing certain metaphorical associations that were powerful conveyors of emotional intensity in his work. This painting, Untitled, from the Yale Art Gallery, has a light gray rectangle at the bottom, which is a sheer veil over the darker red beneath. Note, by using the term veil, I'm already falling into metaphorical language, but that seems appropriate in this case. The orange rectangle above merges at its top into the paler orange ground, undermining the difference between them. A yellow-green strip, it's insufficiently green in this reproduction. In real life, it's got more green to it. In the middle, produces a contrastingly sharp division between the orange and red panels. Issues of framing are central to this picture. We looked at this a moment ago, from 1949, in which a whitened border contains all the unaligned bars and rectangles in the painting. The yellow ground is not visible between the color blocks, the color panels in this picture. Rather, red-orange underpainting peeks through in some places between the color blocks. Here's a detail that shows you, especially in the upper there, you can see that red-orange coming through. Untitled 1952, this slide is way too light. Imagine it a few shades darker. A green middle bar divides the canvas peculiarly. Its color aligns it with the lower rectangles, but its size, the width of it, aligns it with the upper. Dark blue extenders have been added to some of the bars to make them shift in their alliance between the upper or lower series of rectangles. Here's another picture that takes a different approach to color panel relations, the relations of one panel to another. And especially here, figure ground issues emerge as powerful. The slate and brown figures are more recessed from the edges in this picture than is usual in Rothko's paintings, and they seem more securely set on the plumb ground. Until the scheme is disrupted, as you look longer at the picture, you start to notice that there's a plumb panel, a broad panel at the top, that's slightly different in tonality from the ground, and it becomes a more complex compositional arrangement. The handling of edges is spotlighted in this picture from 1955, where a pure green halo is loosely brushed around the darker green rectangle at the top. Along the bottom edge, this halo overlaps the central orange bar, and a blue line emerges fragmentarily from below between the two close-valued red-orange elements, that is right down here. And then one more, another painting that has an interesting handling of edges, especially obvious handling of edges. Untitled 1949, displays a full range of edges from softly feathered, sometimes rubbed with turpentine edges, to relatively hard ones. In this painting, the impulsion to natural metaphor strikes me as particularly strong, largely through the sunset effect suggested by the orange band radiating through the blue-gray plains. Rothko's favorite critics noticed these sorts of subtle manipulations of form, and they recognized the rich metaphorical implications in them. Here, for example, is Dory Ashton. Quote, "The paling edges, the quavering areas of light, the completely ambiguous extremities of Rothko's forms, these are the crucial carriers of Rothko's complex expression," unquote. Rothko's paintings distinguish themselves from those of his abstract expressionist colleagues through the particular metaphorical registers that they suggested. Not the webs and vortexes of Pollock's work, not the cries and commands of Barnett Newman's, but something else which I'll turn now to characterize it. Rothko's paintings were, of course, deliberately abstract. The artist had begun numbering his work in the late 1940s as a way of avoiding the elusiveness of titles. Some critics pointed out Rothko's refusal of clear associations. Sylvester, for example, said, "The spectator has associations, the painting undertakes to reject them," unquote. And here he goes on. To fantasize about these paintings, discover storm clouds or deserts in them, or sarcophagi, or aftermaths of nuclear explosions, is as corny as looking at Gothic architecture and thinking of the noonday twilight of the forest, unquote. But typically for Sylvester, discounting such suggestions in one breath, he introduced his own favorites in the next. Twice he invoked Gothic cathedrals to describe the effects and importance of Rothko's art. As a master purveyor of paradox, Sylvester's inconsistency on the issue of allusions was perhaps more extreme and more evident than that of most critics, but maybe this is precisely why Rothko loved his piece so much. Rothko and his preferred critics engaged in a contradictory process of invoking and disavowing metaphorical associations with his work. Metaphors circled around his paintings, never fixed, always flowing into another, accumulating and layering. In this respect, metaphors and meanings resembled the color shapes in his paintings, which constantly seemed to critics to be shifting, moving, unstable. The boundary between abstraction and illusion is blurred in Rothko's work. It joins the boundaries between forms in demonstrating that ambiguity is the truth of boundaries, as two writers on Rothko, Bersani and Dutoit, have noted. Most reviewers, and Rothko himself, employed associative imagery in relation to his paintings. Rothko clearly was not opposed to this per se, as long as no one illusion was pushed too hard. Preferably, several would be juxtaposed. As I've already noted, light was one of the most common and potent metaphors associated with his paintings. The critic for Art Digest pointed out the coded significance of light as a theme in Rothko's work. Quote, "Light in our culture is the commonest figure of speech for spiritual essence. And these metaphors are ways of saying that Rothko's work is charged with what we mean by matters of the spirit." Unquote. The blending of emotional and spiritual content and nature and otherworldliness, so common in the critical response to Rothko's art, was enabled in large part by the mediation of light and light metaphors. Even before he developed his mature style, Rothko had identified light as a foundational element in his thinking about art and art history. In some of his earliest writing, he wrote about Romanticism and Delacroix, topic of interest to Ike, I know. The expression of emotional tragedy through the agency of light mood. Those are Rothko's words for describing what he saw happening in the work of Delacroix and El Greco, light as a vehicle for tragic emotional intensity. So even before he was making these kinds of pictures, and when he was making his earlier, I do have an example of the earlier work that's not about color, it's about form, that's evocative of myth and primitive motifs. Even then, he was thinking about light as a carrier of emotional intensity. Okay. According to the critics, Rothko's abstract paintings covered the spectrum in relation to light, the kinds of light that they embodied or suggested. Some commentators saw them as generators of light, and they seemed, quote, to have a certain immanent radiance that they exuded, in the words of one critic. Another called them paintings that shimmered with a quite unphysical radiance, and so forth. I won't belabor the point, but many critics used that kind of metaphor of the paintings as generators of light, as one way of thinking about their work. Other critics perceived them as veils or filters, as if light were behind them and filtering the passage of light through them, transforming a light that emanated from behind. The most common image of this type was of, here's an example of that. The light from stained glass windows, an especially effective image in conjoining spirituality and sensuality. One critic said Rothko's light was like, quote, the subdued light of the sun gleaming through a stained glass window of a cathedral. And still others saw them as reflectors of light, receivers or reflectors of light, as if they were screens. For example, this picture. One critic wrote, Rothko's color is luminous and without substance, as if it were light instead of pigment. It's reminiscent of the changing colored light that diffused the interiors of movie palaces in the 20s. And another critic wrote of this painting in particular, that it resembled a white screen flooded with light from a projector in a reddened room, or possibly a rectangle of light glowing through a drawn window shade, unquote. So Rothko's paintings were found often to materialize color and light, while they dematerialized paint and canvas. Such comments acknowledge the frequently thinly painted character of Rothko's paintings. If you look closely at Rothko's surfaces, the paint is often very thin. He often scraped it away, sanded it down, and used that thinness to associate his work with other kinds of color-invested painting, like the work of George Inness and symbolist painters who similarly used a kind of disembodied form of paint to suggest spiritual interests. So light, well actually let me go back. Light is one very powerful set of metaphors for Rothko's paintings. Another is landscape. Landscape leads to a related cluster of associations commonly invoked by Rothko's work. And these have to do with cloud forms of various sorts. As early as 1948, Art News was saying of Rothko's work that loose clouds of color appear to float on the surface. Such imagery was overdetermined by the layering, transparency, edges, and colors of Rothko's paintings, and he himself endorsed this image by using it in some of his titles. For example, this one, Light Cloud, Dark Cloud, from 1957, explicitly making that metaphor apparent. I wanted to show you this photograph of Rothko. This is from an article in Life magazine from 1959. It was part of a series on abstract expressionism. And notice how explicitly the metaphor of landscape is drawn by the authors of this article by putting a blurry photographic landscape at the bottom of the page, simulating the look of a Rothko painting, a way of making the paintings more accessible to a popular audience that still had trouble with abstraction. Sometimes critics evoked imaginative variations on clouds, involving fog or mist. The Burlington magazine, for example, offered an exceptionally poetic take on Rothko's painting in 1961. It described his paintings as tinted steam. Another reviewer cited the romantic shore scenes of Caspar David Friedrich or the atmospheric seascapes of Turner. Quote, "A person walking through a heavy fog has nothing to experience with his eyes but color. And so it is with Rothko's paintings, except that here color is raised to a glowing, singing intensity." For other critics, the fog seemed to thicken to water and submerge the viewer. Quote, "The sensation they provide is unusually physical and unusually enveloping. It's like swimming in deep water or plunging into deep sleep on the softest of beds." Here the sensation of being engulfed by the paintings, remarked by many critics, is given vivid figurative form. So light, fog, nature, clouds, all of these metaphors were circling around Rothko's pictures. And then there was another set as well. Doorways, windows, another frequently invoked set of metaphors the pictures evoked. And these two were evocative. Of course, doorways to hell, we've already heard from one commentator. And Time magazine offered a correspondingly ominous version of the window image, windows looking out on blind space. That the window and doorway had multiple aspects and associations was part of their appeal to Rothko as figures for his paintings. He analyzed the window metaphor along with that of the ladder in an unsigned statement about his work for an exhibition. In this statement, he noted the conflicting functions of windows in his words, allegedly in his words. He didn't sign this statement, so we only have it on secondhand authority that he was in fact the author of it. He wrote, allegedly, "The question of how many windows one opens or how often one pulls down the blinds is a decision concerning self-revelation and reticence." Unquote. Windows are apertures onto exterior space for Rothko, but also devices for exposing interiors. Ladders, by virtue of being bidirectional, also suggested conflicting associations. The possibility of using the ladder to climb higher was associated in his thinking with Jacob's ladder, and he made this association with his pictures, as well as a ladder descending into a grave, into a tomb, another image that he himself evoked in relation to his pictures. So, when Rothko's paintings elicited from viewers the intense and conflicted emotional responses he wanted, it was often through the largely unconscious mediation of layered, overlapping, shifting, and contradictory metaphors: celestial and hellish light, material and immaterial worlds, thresholds, dead ends. What was often lacking in the reviews, however, was full acknowledgement of the contradictions and oppositional tensions Rothko himself saw in his work. Most of the critics were less comfortable than he was with a both-and approach to signification and meaning, and so they gravitated toward one pole or the other. And this frustrated him and led to those tirades against critics that I quoted at the beginning of this talk. So let me begin to move toward a conclusion to these comments. Where does this get us? Writing in 1956, the painter, critic, art historian William Seitz noted that for Rothko, antitheses are neither synthesized nor neutralized in his work, but are held in a confronted unity, which is a momentary stasis. Unquote. Yeah, I know, it's a mouthful. So opposites, they're held, they're not neutralized, they're not synthesized, they're held in a kind of vivid form inside the work, vivid contradictions, not made harmonious. Seitz went on to affirm that Rothko had communicated to him in conversation that Nietzsche's conception of the Apollonian and the Dionysian, that kind of dualism of the conceptual and the anarchic, the orderly and the anarchic, was essential to his thinking about art and tragic art, and was something that was extremely formative for his work. In Rothko's words, "I've believed as long as I can remember that the contemplative exaltation of art is a hollow shell unless it has at its core, unless it is filled to the point of bulging by the wild." Unquote. Seitz associated the contradictions that he saw in Rothko's work with what he called the problem of opposites in abstract expressionist painting. While he recognized this phenomenon, he wasn't at all certain what it signified in the work of these painters. Here's what he wrote. "Is the dualistic formulation a product of our cultural pattern, or is it more deeply embedded in the human personality? Why has duality become so intrinsic a principle of progressive painting? Whatever the reasons for thinking in terms of oppositional concepts and principles may be, our psychic state is surely revealed by it." Our psychic state. Apparently, Seitz identified the oppositional dynamics implicated in Rothko's paintings and abstract expressionism generally with that term, with that state. More importantly, he intuited a link between the art's oppositions and tensions and the psyche or self that it expressed. And here, I would argue, is the bridge that connects Rothko's paintings with those of his contemporaries, Jackson Pollock, Barnett Newman, painters whose work is so different from Rothko's own. While Pollock's work staged the act of painting as a battle between controlling and uncontrollable forces, and Newman's thematized power and powerlessness in wobbling pivots and disrupted structures, Rothko's paintings were understood to contain wild and violent emotional and intellectual conflicts within a structured, orderly field. Like his colleagues in the New York School, Rothko's ambition was to make formally sophisticated modernist paintings that were simultaneously rooted in a notion of selfhood as irredeemably divided and conflicted. As Dory Ashton put it, Rothko, like many other painters of our day, is painting for the new man, this new man whose conflicts and deep self was being explored, and seemed fascinating to so many of these painters. So what I've presented to you tonight is an exploration of the language that Rothko and some of his critics used to plumb the meanings of his paintings. It doesn't give us some core truth of his art, but rather the largely conscious meanings that his art held for this small early interpretive community that included the artist himself. I suspect that many of you will find the meanings I've excavated rather distant from your own experiences of Rothko's paintings. Even if we wanted to, we'd find it hard, I think, to respond to the paintings in exactly the way Rothko wished, to find in their ravishing colors and subtle organizations a tragic mixture of exuberance and despair, to be spiritually and emotionally moved by a mediated experience of their colors and forms, and to savor their structuring metaphors of conflicting oppositions as the fundamental condition of selfhood, of being, of life. But to acknowledge inability to engage the paintings in these terms is not to diminish them or us. My purpose has been to develop an historical appreciation of the configuration of beliefs and ideas in which the paintings were produced and first interpreted, and in which their effects were realized. That moment is now rather distant from ours. Some of its fundamental associations are now untenable. We'd probably be less likely to think about the self in this particular way, or about the fates as putting us in a human situation that is, or maybe we wouldn't think it's a tragic situation that we all live in. Maybe, in fact, these paintings are more pertinent to our current condition than I'm acknowledging. But there are, I think, very fundamental ways in which our beliefs about fundamental ideas have shifted since the heyday of Rothko's paintings. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, new generations of artists and theoreticians were suggesting other varieties of explanation for the same kinds of experiences that Rothko was dealing with. Artists like the Situationists, the Situationist artists, were proposing that mass culture and the society of the spectacle was responsible for our feeling of powerlessness before political and other forces. The concept of human nature was explored by other artists who were finding in it identities marked by issues of gender, race, class, and so forth that were also important components of the identities that we should think about when we think about identity in painting. So the persistence of ideas like those in our time, they give us reason to believe that if we continue to interpret paintings like Rothko's as engaging these themes, they will continue to have relevance and beauty for viewers for generations to come. But if we're not quite reduced to tears by Rothko's paintings, or if we're not inspired by them to the same kinds of reflections on emotional life and human tragedy, that may not be so bad a thing. The disappearance of some of the codes within which the paintings operated produces estrangement from them, which is both inevitable and desirable. Engaged appreciation of Rothko's art requires a double vision, a vision of its historical character and a critically discerning vision of what is living and what is dead in it for us. Can his art's structuring themes be reinterpreted to suit the ways we think now, without reviving untenable models of selfhood and human history? That's the challenge Rothko's paintings present to us, his 21st century critics and viewers. Thank you very much. We're happy to take questions or comments.
The last,
Could we bring the lights down a little bit so the paintings could still be visible? Especially in the front there. If this front row can come up, that would be really nice.
the last three Rothko sold for between $49 and $90 million. That puts him among the Da Vinci's, Picasso's, Rembrandt's, Van Gogh's, Monet's of the world.
Yeah.
You really are as emotionally moved by the 893 paintings he did, 700 horizontal stripes, a couple vertical, he got radical, as you are by those artists.
Oh, so you're not moved by Rothko's work? Is that what it is? I'm sorry?
I said the question would have some bias. When you compare him to those people,
Yeah.
the greatest artists of the time, which is what the market is saying, you are equally as moved by him as you are by Da Vinci, by Rembrandt, by Picasso, by Van Gogh, by Monet.
If you're asking about me personally, I have no problem saying yes to that question. I mean, I think Rothko's paintings are tremendous. Have you been to, say, MoCA in LA, the room of Rothko's paintings?
I grew up in New York, I've seen him for 40 years.
Okay, but they don't do anything. Well, you know,
No,
that's
it's
fun.
the Upper East Side, the Gallery, the Whitney, he's had enough.
Yeah. Well, you know, what I was trying to do today, in a way, is point to some of the subtleties at work in Rothko's paintings that make it clear that they're not as simple as they look. They're not, you know, they're not mindless, slapped together things. There's a lot of very complex pictorial dynamics operating in these pictures, and they're being extremely evocative in terms of the kinds of multiplied, conflicting metaphors that they evoke. I challenge you to do as well with, you know, even with figurative painting. You know, figurative painting is not going to be as metaphorically elusive and rich. It has a different kind of set of responses that it's going for. You have to shift into a different register to get into the frame of mind that will, within which this kind of work will resonate.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to be as controversial, but I have two questions. One might be controversial. First, his relationship, spirituality, involvement, and morality concepts with Thomas Merton. You might want to comment a little bit on that. And last but not least, the controversial litigation that occurred in his final trust.
Yeah. Well, right. Well, yeah, we all know that. I don't know if we want to go into that. I mean, yes, it's true. There's been there's all kinds of sordid episodes around not only Rothko's pictures, but abstract expressionist paintings in general. You know, unfortunate dealings and fraudulent pictures and so forth. That's there. I don't particularly have anything enlightening to say about that. About his interest in spirituality, absolutely. I mean, he and Barnett Newman in particular thought a great deal about the otherworldly, about especially Jewish religious themes, and you know, in no sense were they attempting to illustrate that religion, but I think the sense of spirit that came through, in part through light metaphors, and you know, through some of the other kinds of allusions that he articulated in relation to his work, made very clear that spirituality was crucial to his thinking about the content of his pictures and how they worked.
Thanks, Michael, for a really engaging talk. You talked about three sort of categories of metaphors that Rothko enjoyed when they were employed about his work, or at least three categories.
Yeah.
There was the question of pure color, there's the idea of windows and doorways, and then at the beginning there was the Gothic cathedral idea that came up. And the latter two, the windows, the window in particular, and the Gothic cathedral, for an art historian, are both pretty loaded. And the window, I think, of alberti and perspective and the picture plane and the picture being like a window, the frame being like a window, and a kind of a construction of truth, symbolic truth at least. I mean, I don't know exactly when Panofsky wrote the symbolic form, perspective as symbolic form, but it was around mid-century, I think. And the Gothic cathedral is an incredibly overdetermined work of art as well, full of very, very precise meanings. So both of these are metaphors or points of comparison that have to do with very precise meanings, almost programmatic, religious, ideological meanings. So what do you think Rothko necessarily enjoyed about being compared with those, given that he seemed to be trying to get as far away as possible from being pinned down?
Well, I think, right, that's a really nice opposition with different kinds of windows and different kinds of spatial illusions and ideas that they would evoke. I think he would have resisted the suggestion of the Alberti perspectival window as way too precise and a different kind of sense of truth than the truth that he was after. I think I'm really not. I'm not saying anything more than that there is, that's a nice opposition that really puts the preference that he had for a certain kind of way of thinking about windows in. It makes it vivid that there's an alternative way that was quite distant from his preferred way of thinking about metaphor and meaning and truth as precise. That's great. Thank you for that.
This was really interesting, but it seemed to me that your lecture today talked about somebody else. It talked about Rothko's interpretation of his own work, the critic's interpretation of his work. I wonder if we could darken the lights and you could just look at that painting and tell us what you see.
You didn't get enough self-revelation from all these other people.
I want to hear what you have to say, what you, not them.
What you heard tonight was me. But let me tell you, it's not. There is not another self that I was hiding from you behind all of these other selves. This is the way. I'm an art historian, and the way I think about art is deeply conditioned by years and years of thinking historically about art. So when I approach a Rothko, I can't just stand there and free associate and emote. I have to think. Mondrian Albers, Sylvester Doriash.
Of course.
That's.
This painting is in front of us.
No, it isn't actually. That is.
Well, I would do the same thing I just did and talk about edges and light and transparency and opacity and ground. You know how unfortunately when you have a reproduction, you don't have enough detail to actually read out the layering in the picture. I can't go up here and say, well, is that red painted over the darker floor, or is that underneath and showing through? Because the slide doesn't give you enough detail. If I can do that in the gallery, I really enjoy going up close and seeing how the picture is made, and then stepping back and seeing what kind of different effect I get from those forms. And I will look at the edges and the ways the edges have been formed at different points in the picture, and think about the kinds of things they make me think of. I was actually trying to give you today a map for how I would think about these pictures in terms of formal features that evoke metaphors that then supply a sense of emotional intensity to the work. That's what I got.
One more question.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask, considering our very aggressive questioning, to ask about the public's response towards Rothko's work. I mean, the 50s considered a very conservative period of time.
Yes.
Obviously, the public still has a certain amount of aggression and anger and misunderstanding of his work. Maybe you could discuss that and maybe give your own opinions about this.
Yes, I don't think, I think Rothko's work was not the most difficult for popular audiences of abstract expressionist work. I think Barnett Newman and Jackson Pollock were probably different kinds of, they had very different forms of work that, that really did infuriate viewers. Newman for its reductiveness, its hard-edged simplification. There seemed to be so little there. And Pollock for the chaos and the craziness of this order of it. But Rothko is always beautiful, even if you think there's too little there, or even if you think, your kid could do that. There's always something redeeming about it. Or so it seemed. I mean, that's not to say that he didn't face a lot of hostility along with his colleagues in the abstract expressionist movement in the 50s and 60s. He's a tragic case. He committed suicide, not for lack of attention or for lack of commissions. He was getting those. It was, there were other kinds of demons that were tormenting him. But he was receiving very prestigious commissions to produce murals for restaurants and universities, and he made murals for the Rothko Chapel in Houston. Yes, he was facing antagonism, but he was also met with a substantial amount of success, certainly enough to sustain many an artist. So he had a conflicted reception in his among our early audiences. Thank you.
Ran out of time, but really very much appreciate your attention, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. We are still open, and this is our late night Thursday, so please do go up and enjoy the garage as well, and come back frequently. Thank
Did you want to hit the gallery at all?
you.